Well, welcome back, everybody. I'm going to introduce our invited speaker in a second, Étienne Achille. I just wanted to let you know the building now has new rules, and they close everything and set the alarm at 7 o'clock. And so I spoke with the guardians, and we really have to finish at quarter till. So we'll wrap up at quarter till, and if everybody could be out on the sidewalk, otherwise they're going to start to give us a lot of problems. I'd greatly appreciate it. The other thing I'd love to do is catch up before everybody kind of scatters and runs off after today, just to figure out, I know there's at least one group for the final conference who'd like to have a little bit more time. There are two groups that seem content with the allotted time, and if I could just get a sense from you, that way we can kind of balance things out so that we allocate the time accordingly, and we might make a few schedule changes for the last day on Thursday. So that's it for that. What I wanted to do then was introduce Étienne Achille, who is a professor in the Romance Language Department. It's Romance Language and Studies, I believe, or they change the topic the exact title every year, it seems. But at Villanova University, he is a specialist in contemporary French Francophone post-colonial studies, looking at literature, but then also kind of mass culture. And the book that we're going to discuss that he has right here is a book that he co-authored with Lydie Moudileno called Mythologies Postcoloniales. We had originally planned on doing the session with Lydie, who unfortunately couldn't join us, so Étienne is going to kind of represent both of them in this regard. They have a forthcoming book as well that will be out in English in January called Realms of Memory, which is, from what I understand, a kind of extension of this project that is sistering off of, but I think also in a critical way, Pierre Nora's project called Lieux de Mémoire, or Realms of Memory, that's looking at the kind of post-colonial dimensions, but as it's inscribed within urban space and other such things. And so with Étienne, and talking about how best to facilitate the session, he's going to begin with a kind of maybe 15-20 minute framing of the project itself. I have a few questions to get the ball rolling, and then we'll open things up and have plenty of time, and I'll take stack, and we'll run the discussion from there. So with no further ado, I'll turn everything over to Étienne.
Cool. Thank you, Gabriel. Thanks for the invite, I appreciate it. Thank you all. I'm glad to be here and to be able to discuss this book with you. It is exciting to have people to actually discuss live rather than reviews and off comments. This is exciting, so I'm very pleased to be here. Just a few points to start with the context in which the book was produced and what we tried to achieve with it. And then we can also maybe move on to the chapter that we posted online, which is, I think, a good presentation of what we try to do. So I'm going to assume you might not be very familiar with the context, what's going on in France in terms of post-colonial issues, immigration, and so on. So I will start with the basic points. Excuse me if you know that already. Just trying to make sure everyone can follow what's happening here. The idea is that what is happening in France today, as it pertains to post-colonial issues, is very different than in the UK and the US. We are way, way behind in terms of where the debate stands on those issues. There is a lot of silence that surrounds those problems. And our job as scholars interested in the topic is really to make sure we actually start to create a debate on those questions. Because right now in France, whether it is on the academic, institutional side, or the official government aspect of things, the post-colonial perspective is not something very prevalent or something that is easily adopted, discussed, or accepted as a valid present to look at contemporary France. So it's really something that we have to build from the ground up in the steps of historians and people in sociology who started to do so. Really in France, of course, we can go back to Césaire and Fanon, sure, but in terms of what is happening in contemporary France, it's the turn of the millennium, it's the early 2000s where things start to pick up, and also post-2005. If you are aware of what happened in 2005, you had some big issues in France, urban riots in the banlieue, the areas around Paris and other big cities, that kind of trigger attention in terms of what is happening in the banlieue, inequalities and so on, things that we know for a long time, but that has been swept under the carpet for the last 30 years, and that re-emerged in 2005 following the violence that took place. Right here, you just can drive half an hour, and you are in the areas when you take the train from the airport, and you cross those banlieues underprivileged parts of the city of Paris, of France, and this is the poorest department in France, right north of here, the Seine-Saint-Denis, where people from immigration, from the former colonies, and first generation French are overrepresented and suffer from very strong discrimination, housing, employment, and just to be accepted as legit French citizens. This is the overall context, we know that, and yet we are not able to look at those issues from a post-colonial perspective, meaning how can we engage with this in terms of the continuity between the colonial times and today, not an exact replica, but as a moment where the collective imaginary has been shaped by those periods, and people still very much consider or think of themselves and the other in the same, on similar terms than people did back in the days during the time of imperialism in France. It was maybe a short period of time compared to French history, but from the 17th century to 1962, it was very intense, it was very present, and this left significant and very potent traces. And we're trying to think those through in order to make sense of what is happening today, thanks to this larger perspective on French history. So again, people in the UK and the US have been doing this for a while, people in France are still reluctant to do so, so the book is an attempt to move the ball forward a little bit. It's a very humble attempt at doing so, but we're trying to do our share in order to help the debate make progress. So, today in France, you have, to simplify things, you really have two types of people in terms of attitude towards the post-colonial. You have plenty of people who, and more who are moving towards what we call the reactionary aspect of things. It's getting ground over a few years. People who basically trying to rewrite a little bit the history of France in terms of the colonial times, in order of saying that, it was not that bad, France did great things, people should be lucky that we went there and that we colonized them. That is, of course, completely insane, and yet under the guidance of a few very public intellectuals, this discourse is getting more and more attention, traction, and is being more and more received. This is not the people we're trying to reach with the book, to be honest. This is people it's difficult to dialogue with and to really have something productive. On the other side of this very tense and very polarized debate, you have people who don't see the relevance, people who are very indifferent to these issues. They just don't see why we should look at those issues through this perspective. And they're saying, well, colonies, it's over, and it was finished in 1962 with Algeria becoming independent. That was the last colony to do so. And people have turned the page and believe that today's France has nothing to do with what happened back in the days. That's the people trying to reach in a way, saying that, wait a minute, we're going to show you that in the everyday, in your life, everywhere, you are surrounded by traces of signs that bear traces of this colonial ideology. It's very much present, and you've been here in Paris for 3 weeks. You've been exposed to this a lot. It's difficult to grasp, it's difficult to identify, because we believe they function as myth in the Barthesian way. You consume those presentations without really knowing it, and yet it's there, it's charged, and it's reinforcing a certain order of things in a way that is sometimes difficult to actually realize. We're trying to show that people that it starts with being able to see this, to be able to pause in your daily life and to realize that the social text has a strong layer of colonial ideology still present, still very active, and that still governs the way people think. So, to use the famous term in French post-colonial studies, the idea is to address the silence or the aphasia that is characteristic of the debate in France. Aphasia in the sense that Anne-Laura Stoller has defined it. 3 points that I think summarize what we tried is to address the occlusion of knowledge, to address the difficulty to generate vocabulary about this issue, and lastly, the difficulty to comprehend the enduring legacy of the colonial. That's the 3 points we try to address in the book by looking at popular culture and every aspect of it, from sports to food, to film, to street sign, to the French Academy and literature in general. Different aspects that continue to bear traces of this ideology. 2 more minutes, and then I promise I will let you speak. How did we get to Barthes? Again, we believe that Barthes in his work on myth was the most appropriate because it was a pure exercise in unpacking or trying to decipher the quotidian, mass culture, collective representations, in a way that would allow us to pause and actually understand what is being given to us and what we consume in a very passive way. So it's not a class about Barthes at all, but just in case you're not familiar with the idea of myth, Barthes worked on the idea of applying Saussure work on linguistic science to the social text, explaining that the myth is a secondary semiotical system that feeds off a primary linguistic system. So you have a signifier and a signified that gives you a sign, and the myth swoops in the sign in order to replace this literal denotation with a connotation that is ideologically, politically, historically charged. The sign of the first linguistic system becomes a form that receives a concept that becomes a new signification. Okay? The best example to illustrate is the famous picture of the black soldier that Barthes discusses in his book Mythologies from 1957. He has a Paris Match cover of a young African kid doing the salute like this. And he explains that this is a great example to understand how myth functions. Are you familiar with this picture of Barthes? So he was a young guy, a young African kid. He was in Paris to participate in the Army Nights, which was to display the colonial troops serving France at the time of colonization. But this cover shows you a young kid doing this. What you see is therefore, at the primary level, something very neutral. Okay? A young African kid doing this. You find that his name is Diouf. He comes from Burkina Faso, and he's here to participate in the Army Nights. But it's not what the image is showing. There's a myth that circulates based on that. The myth is that at the time of decolonization in France, we are in 1957, the empire is starting to crumble. Showing this to the people on the cover of a popular magazine is a way to reinforce colonial ideology. They think that what we see is not a young kid doing this, it's a young kid saluting France and the greatness of the empire, right? And it's in order to reinforce the idea that France should stay in the colonies and France is right to fight in Algeria and so on. You see the difference between what the image shows and what the myth is trying to circulate. Right? So myth just sees, grasp the primary meaning in order to circulate something else. This becomes, we imagine the flag, we imagine a kid being thankful for the empire. It's not what the image shows, but it's what it's trying to say. That's the connotation of the image. That's the myth that the image is trying to circulate. So that's the starting point for us and Barthes. And we apply this to different examples of culture to show that what we see in France every day has this layer of the colonial that is hidden, that circulates in terms of in a way that's very anonymous and yet very effective and very potent. That's why we went to Barthes. The idea being, of course, people to realize where they live, what the text around them means, what the signs around them actually bears, in order to participate into the process of finally finding a way to decolonize the French imaginary, something that has not been addressed for the last 60 years now, after the independences and the official end of colonization. No one has worked on finding a way to address the way people think about this in a systematic way. School doesn't do it, no one else is done, so it's been the work of artists, scholars, and so on to try to address those questions. Are responsible for a great deal of the issues we see in terms of racism in today's France. That's in a nutshell the project. I don't know if you want me to jump to the chapter, or maybe just starting to discussion with the introduction first, or...
Yeah, we can start with that, and then you have other things.
Yeah, other things.
Bon Dieu. The
Bon Dieu after, but maybe the first round of discussion.
Yeah, sure, we can get things started. Yeah, one of the things that I wanted to ask you is you frame the project in terms of a critique of the idea that race would be a kind of given natural entity, and you really insist on it being an imaginary social construct.
Yeah.
And there's of course an enormous body of literature on this that has defined this, I think, in some depth.
Yeah.
But at the same time, a lot of people who aren't familiar with particular debates on race and racism might find it very counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Just insofar as a standard kind of aesthetic apprehension of other racialized beings tends to be one in which, well, a person who's black, it just looks black, or a person who's white just looks white.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you could explain why it's important for you to identify how the process of racialization is an imaginary process as opposed to a real process.
Sure.
But also why it is that even though it's imaginary, it seems so fundamentally natural to the way in which most people perceive the world. Right?
Yeah.
So it's like, how does the imaginary become real in the minds of most people?
Yeah, sure. And thanks. It's a good question because in the French context, race doesn't exist. As you know, we follow a very specific model that is a universal model where race does not exist, and we are different than the US, for instance, where race is a big part of everyday life. In France, everyone is French, no matter of your race or religion. Officially, we are all equal before the law, and as it pertains to the great ideals of the French nation, liberté, égalité, fraternité. But there is no race officially in France. Yet, of course, there is racism, and of course, people continue to see race today as a categorization of life. So this comes from, in particular, from the colonial times, of course. The construction of race parallels very exactly colonization, slavery, and the need to justify, of course, those practices. You see that race was theorized towards the late 18th century, and actually the philosopher Hegel played a big part in that role. But it was about what we, in French studies, what we look at, and especially towards the 19th century, when the idea of Frenchness was defined in France, at the beginning of the Third Republic, and there was a complete reinvention of French history and French identity, with a narrative that was built in order to create continuity in French history from the Gauls to today. And Africa, the Caribbean, played a big part in terms of defining the other towards which French people were to be constructed. And of course, race played a primary role in this. To be French is, above all, to be white, according to this mechanism that continues to be very potent and prevalent. And that dates back to, again, the late 19th, when French history was reinvented at the time, with what we call the roman national narrative, building a sense of belonging, of Frenchness, and so forth. So our point here is the same as many people in the field, is that there is no race in terms of biology. We all agree that race doesn't exist biologically at all, but it does exist in terms of social construction. It's impossible to address racism without talking about race. You have a current in the field that tries to do anti-racist discourse activities without talking about race. We believe it's complicated, impossible. You have to discuss those issues. You have to put race on the table, which is something that might seem obvious to many of you, but that is completely strange to most French people. As again, race does not exist technically in France. So we take the counter step for that, and we put it at the center of the reflection, because indeed it doesn't exist, but it exists in people's mind. It plays a big part in how they define themselves and the other, and therefore the only way to deconstruct those problematic attitudes and ways of thinking is to put it at the center.
Right.
So it's a construct, a social construct that dates centuries back, that needs to be addressed, and the first thing is, it's just to debate it. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Yeah, maybe I could follow up with it. One of the other things that's really key to the argument that you make is that national identities are equally imaginary constructs.
Sure.
And so it seems that one of the complications is that as long as you have a nation state that establishes a certain mode of identification through cultural practices or other such things, in France, of course, this would be la francité, or what Frenchness is, that necessitates, it seems, a disidentification from other practices.
Yes.
So as soon as you say that Frenchness is X, then it's not, Y, Z, and all these other things.
Right.
And so I wonder if inherent in the very imaginary construction of a nationalist identity is the necessity of certain forms of otherness that would then be excluded, that would define what Frenchness is, almost by its own, by negation, if you will.
Yeah.
And so is there a kind of almost double bind of sorts in which to deal seriously with racial exclusion, it would seem you'd also have to dismantle the very idea of Frenchness or of certain imagined nationalist identities.
Yeah, I think on the long term, yeah. Right now it seems a bit utopian to think that way. Most people agree that right now it's about defining a lot less rigid understanding of Frenchness.
Right.
Because right now in France, I mean, it's quite simple. I mean, I don't try to oversimplify things, but we don't have that much time. But in most people's minds, to be French is basically three things. There's a race aspect, it's still to be white. There's a religion aspect, it's still to be of Catholic heritage, Christian, but particularly Catholic, and also to be of a certain Greco-Latin cultural heritage as well. It's still very prevalent, and it's not everyone, of course, not everyone, but even the most progressive people still believe that there is some truth to that.
Right.
So right now the idea would be to deconstruct this in order to have understanding of French that is a bit more inclusive than that, and eventually to get maybe rid of altogether of this just very secluded idea of national identity. But that is very much tied up to the idea of nation state, and the two together seems to be inseparable, and as long as we have this model, it's difficult to part ways with the idea of national identity. I see the two are being very much related, and this might explode soon. We thought that with Europe, we're moving towards a different model, but given the state of Europe and what our friends, the Brits, are doing right now, we're going back to keeping the same model for a long time, I would say. So that's a good point, because it's important to understand the fact that this exclusion of the other is also evolving over time, and what we see right now today is Islam being the focus of the discussion. Was not the case even 70 years ago. This is very much tied to immigration post-World War II. Right. As you know, after war, France opened the borders to rebuild the country, massive immigration from the Maghreb, North Africa, that resulted in a change of demographics and the rise of Islam, for instance. And Islam has become the center point in terms of defining who is French and who is not. So it evolves given the different waves of immigration and who is defined as the primary other within the French borders. The Muslim being today crystallizing all of what is not French in a way, what you need to distance yourself and how you need to define yourself in relation to in the binary position. So it's interesting to see the different evolution, whether it was first Italian, Polish people, and then up to the point where now it has become the Muslim, as well as the black person in general as well.
Right. Right. One of the other things I was curious about, because you do an excellent job in the book just going through the kind of ways in which the colonial mythology has been layered into the daily experience of subjects.
Yeah.
A lot of the focal point seems to be on the kind of the visual interface of subjects in their daily lives and the things that they'll see, the names of streets, the names of, what do you call them, sweets in bakeries and things like this, and films. I was wondering, the relationship between this immediate quotidian environment and deeper infrastructural elements that function, particularly in France, as a mode of racialized and socioeconomic exclusion. Things such as urban planning, the fact that, I mean, Paris is, maybe you can address this, but Paris is quintessentially structured in that way. But not just urban planning, it's also the ways in which certain communities are radically segregated and that you have a whole vocabulary around that. La racaille, les casseurs, and it segments populations in very specific ways that have to do not just with the kind of zones of visibility of quotidian life, but also with socioeconomic hierarchies of a very, very rigid sort. So I was wondering if you could address that, and I'm curious if that relates to the Realms of Memory book that you're working on.
In a way, sure, yeah. So those are traces, traces that you can, again, trace back from colonial times. You have to be careful explaining that what we live right now is not a complete, an exact replication of what happened in the past, but all of those examples you gave, urban planning, access to education, including this institution, for instance, pastries, language, all of this is an evolution from a much more intense moment in French history where those were the center of life. You had a very intense colonial propaganda at the time in France when you had to convince people of the importance in the empire. Those were times where this hierarchy was never to be questioned, whether it's racial and so on. This is different now. This is no more acceptable, and yet it's still done, but in a much more insidious ways. And to do that, you have to keep it invisible. You have to reassert the order in a way that is still compatible with the discourse of openness and multiculturality, when yet in reality you are continuing to make sure that a certain population doesn't access certain services and so on. The urban planning is important because, I mean, we are in a case scenario in Paris that is very similar to what in the colonies, between the European city and the indigenous part of town. Same thing with the banlieue, where people are kept around town with very little access to Paris itself, which means also no access to education and so on, and no social mobility, which guarantees the continuous domination of a certain group of people in France, and again, the people that fit the bill that I just gave you a bit earlier on. So some people who are pushing things far will tell you that nothing has changed. It's just done in a much more subtle way in order to guarantee the same results.
Right.
And our job is to expose those techniques and practices. And it goes from making it impossible or difficult for someone from the banlieue to access a school like this, to continuing to impose a form of humiliation in the everyday life when you sell pastries in chocolate that are named Negro's Head, for instance, and that people are like, well, you know, that's okay. So it goes from a wide range of ways to do so, that always connect to reaffirming the order and the right to do such things for us at home, right? Because the discourse is being that the colonies are over, but we are now being colonized by the others with immigration. So they need to reaffirm a certain idea of Frenchness and a certain hierarchy of things that, according to some people, is being meddled because of the discourse about multicultural and immigration and so on.
Which might be a good way to segue into if you have other comments on the Bon Dieu chapter.
Yeah, so, yeah, I don't know if you saw the film. Have you seen the film? Qu'est-ce qu'on a fait au Bon Dieu? This comedy. So, it's a good example because it's a hugely popular comedy. It's 12 million people went to see it. It's top 10 of the biggest box office success in France. It's a terrible film. It's really, really bad, but it's a film that takes care of this in a way that, under the guise of a discourse about openness and the idea that, just if you haven't seen it, it's a story of a bourgeois Catholic couple. They have 4 daughters, and the daughter happen to marry someone from immigration in a row. So the first one marries a Jew, and then an Arab, always quote unquote, a Chinese person, and a black person. And they're all French, obviously, but according to the parents, they are not. And they're having a very hard time coming to terms with the daughters, who are good Catholic girls, marrying into this diversity. And the idea is that the racist father finally accepts it, and this evolution about, yes, we have an issue in France about racism, but you see, even the most racist people, if they are exposed to difference, will open up and accept that these people are indeed French, and the future is bright. We all love each other. Well, it's a comedy. It's supposed to play on easy things like this, but the problem is that it does reinforce very problematic issues. As if you look at the film closely, what it does is actually show that nothing changes. That despite the diversity, despite the fact that people look different, they actually will end up completely assimilating, not integrating, but assimilating to the French norms and way of doing things, and they do not threaten this order of things. For instance, the quote-unquote Arab, for instance, is a good Arab in the sense that he drinks wine, he doesn't pray, and so on. The Jewish is a good Jewish in the sense that he does not eat kasher. They're all really, really French. They stand up, they sing the Marseillaise. This scene that is completely insane, that they get up, and there is this idea that minorities do not love France and do not want to integrate. The movie shows that no, they love France, they're here to assimilate, and there's nothing to worry about. So it's about reassuring the viewer that despite the changes you see around, despite the anxiety about the future of France, in the end, the last daughter does get married in the same church where a mother and grandmother got married. The father of the groom, who is from Africa, goes to dinner with the white man and enjoys a good steak and frites and drinks the wine and comes to the conclusion that France is indeed a superior nation. And Barthes talks about the superiority in his book about the steak and frites and wine being the national symbols of Frenchness that are, if you consume them and accept them, it's like passing your diploma of good integration. You have to show willingness to be French by drinking wine and appreciating this national treasure. So the movie does this in a way that I think is unconscious. They don't know, I don't think they read Barthes, to be honest, but they actually play on this in a way that it left us, people who are working on the subject, completely baffled by deciding that how can you actually enjoy the message of this film that is there to just tell you that don't worry, nothing is going to change. And the other that you see as dangerous, as a menace to your Frenchness is not going to be that. It's going to be someone who is going to accept every terms of the contract, knowing that this contract benefits you, and that they are actually willing to give up anything that makes them culturally different in order to become French, good French like you. They have absolutely no cultural differences to them, which is fine in a way, but they are presented as being the Chinese, the Arab, and so on. They are not in a way. They are not bringing anything different to the table, which we could add to the mix in a way, in terms of, against the idea of less rigid Frenchness. No, they are just embracing this old, traditional idea of Frenchness. So the movie functions like this, and people leave the theater relieved, stress-free. It's a simple fix to the issue, and they can go back to their daily lives thinking that we're in good shape, despite what we see around, despite the tension, despite the fact that minorities are in France asking to be recognized as such, as French, equal but different, not equal but the same. No, all of that is going to go away. They will realize that they are better off by just accepting the terms that are being proposed to them. So the film does something very different than what we see at first glance. It is very insidious, very subtle. Good example of different myths being disseminated and consumed in a way that people don't realize because they go there and have a good laugh, love the film. They don't see that actually it just makes them feel better because they don't think differently about the situation. They are reinforced in their rigid understanding of France and Frenchness. So it's a basic example, but a good one, we believe, because again, 12 million people in the theater, if you add the DVDs and the TV viewings, we can assume that maybe a third of the French population saw the film, because it's a small country, 60 plus million. They probably reach at least 18 million people saw the film. It's huge. And a good example of how those myths can be widely spread around and have, we believe, very disastrous effects on the debate and what we're trying to achieve in terms of moving the ball forward. It's the contrary. We're taking several steps backwards with this type of presentation of French and its future. So that's the idea of the chapter.
Yeah, maybe I could ask you a question about this, and then we can kind of open it up for a broader discussion. One of the things I thought was quite remarkable about the film is that everyone is wealthy.
Yes.
Obviously, the French family is, because they're a Catholic family, very bourgeois. But then all of the people issus de l'immigration who are trying to assimilate are one of the reasons that they're not a threat is because they're all cadres, right? They're all lawyers or business people, etc. And so that there is one of the other messages I think that's embedded within the film is that people coming from elsewhere are okay if they can be assimilated into bourgeois culture, and it's not just the wealthy status. They're all extremely patriarchal in their relations. It's the father giving the women away, the men who then become, there's a camaraderie between them, extremely heteronormative about all of the relations, and it creates this sense of almost whiteness as culture, meaning if you're wealthy and you share particular cultural practices, then you can be accepted within the kind of overall normative culture. That I just wanted to highlight, but then the question is, the presentation of racism, I think, is quite extraordinary because everybody's racist. Everybody in the film, one of the most racist characters in the film is a black father from Africa, right? And so I think that what this message is communicating is that racism is almost a kind of personal attitude that is natural to particular groups who would stereotype other groups. and that we can all get along, though, if we can overcome that by sharing in this kind of bourgeois melodrama, because that's what the film ultimately is.
Yeah.
And so I was curious about how we could relate that understanding of racism, which is very widespread. Racism is a personal moral attitude, and you just have to kind of convince people by hanging out with other people, and they'll get over their racism, versus other understandings of racism, which I think are inscribed within the book that you've written with Lydie, and that is racism understood as part of a historical colonial project for dividing people, justifying mass genocide, establishing socioeconomic relations that are embedded within capitalist exploitation, primitive accumulation, etc., which is very different than a personal attitude. Right? You don't get rid of racism by just then, hanging out with a few people who are from elsewhere.
So the film does not address the latter.
Oh, not at all. But your book does.
Yes, and that's the part of the cover-up of the film. If you want the idea that the minorities in the film are as racist as Claude with the bourgeois Catholic central character. And the message is simple, it's in order to, again, reassure the people. The idea is that they are as racist as we are. And therefore, the whole discourse that's okay. Yeah, that's okay, because we are being stigmatized right now in this vertical understanding, saying that, the majority oppresses the minorities. So no, it's the, I think it's the Arab character. We said at some point, we are all a little bit racist. And we're like, yeah, it's true. And therefore, it's another example to reassure you that it's okay. It's part of who we are. They are also, and this is something that can be overcome by a simple dinner over steak and fries, talk things out, and
some red wine,
and things will be okay. So it plays again on the idea of anxiety that people feel today about the future of the nation, and saying that it's okay, it's natural. It's natural. It is not the result of construction. It is not the result of reinforcing order. It's just how it is. And therefore people feel good about this, saying that if they have doubts about how they perceive the other, saying that, okay, so this is just how it is, and we can easily fix that with a bit of goodwill. We, of course, take the other approach, saying that what we see in the film is a direct legacy of the construction we talked about, and therefore we try to deconstruct this easy message by complexifying those representations. But the idea of the film, the idea of the debate right now is to simplify things as much as possible, to inject simplicity in a complex matter in order for people to not have to think too much about it, not have to question their beliefs and understanding, and to keep the ball going as it is. I wanted to go back to this idea of wealth, and it's important because the film shows you a different image of the minorities. We are often used in France to films taking place in the banlieue, where the depiction is also highly problematic. It's always poor drug dealers and unemployed people. We could be glad in a way to show a different type of minorities being shown on screen. But again, it's the idea that the minorities in the film work together for the goodness or the greatness of France. Someone is going to open a business. So I believe it's the Jewish character who is going to open a halal bio organic food business. So as an it makes no sense, but so he needs the help of the Arab character to get credibility to do so, because as a Jewish person he cannot sell halal. It would be a problem, and of course he needs the help of the Chinese character, who, as a good banker, is going to finance the three of them. So you have the minorities.
That's such a good film.
I mean, I don't know how you come up with that, and it works. But, so they are working together for France. They are creating a company, they are creating jobs, they are wealthy, and they are not a problem at all. And when they stand up and sing the Marseillaise as well, it's again an idea of the myth of, I don't know if you remember that, and you were young, but in '98, France won the World Cup for the first time. We won the World Cup last year as well, but for the first time in '98 in France, and there was a great moment of euphoria in France, because it was a very diverse team. For the first time, the French team was very diverse, with the black players, Arab players, and so on. And people were like, oh yes, that's a winning team, multicultural team that wins for France. And for a few months, people were saying that, okay, this is the France that we like, diverse, working together, winning for France. That, of course, died off after a few months, and we went back to the good old ways. But the film plays on that. This idea of the myth of the France black, blanc for white, and beurre is a name for first generation French from Arab background. Working together, winning for France, being wealthy, educated, and not being a threat to the French future. But as long as they are like this, right? And there is a moment in the film that's very interesting. We see the Arab, Rashid, his name is, he's a lawyer, and he's a lawyer who defends people from the banlieue. And we see two scenes where he defends a guy, the stereotypical Maghrebi character, who got arrested for dealing cannabis. And the contrast is marking between the two. Rashid being the good one, and the other one being the dangerous threat to the French nation. So that was an important point to absolutely to make. And as you said, our end goal is post-colonial. This is a gold mine for every possible end goal. You could do something on gender studies, for the patriarchal things, and so on. It's every possible aspect of the order, capital O, that are being talked about in the film. Ours is race, but I agree that the patriarchal tone, undertone of the film is absolutely baffling as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And sexuality.
And sexuality, absolutely. So, yeah.
Maybe we could open up, and I can kind of take stack if people want to jump in. Maybe Lawrence first, and I'll take.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the talk and for the book. So maybe just a remark. I think people always freak out about something like Stalinist cultural politics, but I mean, let's be honest. If one would get rid of these films, no one would really complain, or we wouldn't lose anything. But or filmmakers.
A chapter in my book, but that's okay.
In your introduction to the Mythologies Postcoloniales, you talk about this conviction of this whole discourse of post-racial societies, which of course is also like a very dominant narrative in the US, more on the let's say conservative side, but also part of the liberal side, the liberal discourse. And you also insist on this point, which I mean, actually should be. It seems obvious on the coming from critical theory that language, behavior, and images on page 12 are presented as being neutral. And now, I think what I found so compelling about your approach is that you address a certain audience in the first place and say, well, this is something we need to remind the left of primarily, because it's not just like racial essentialism or sort of the pretension or colonialist oblivion on the right, but very often liberal discourses, or in France one probably would call it the socialist, socialist narratives. They use these concepts of diversity, multiculturalism, and then culture becomes like almost like a coded version of race or ethnicity, and these words are itself taken from a very essentialist use and context. Like this is, I think, the main three assets of the book. Would you? But how would you see, or if you can make a certain comparison between like the so-called left liberals in the U.S. and France, because you're also working in that context.
Yes. Thank you for your close reading of the introduction. I appreciate that. It's absolutely right on point here. I would say, from the left, you're right. The left wing people in France are our primary audience or target, because even the people who would agree with us on principle are never going to question the tenets of the social model or the social way to conceive of France. No one in France that I know, and I tend, of course, to know more people on the left, are going to question the limits of the concept of universalism, for instance. People believe in that. They really think that this is working, that this is actually a universal by essence, where no, of course not. Of course it's Eurocentric, of course it's very limited, and it's an empty concept. So my answer, maybe I'm not directly answering your question, and I'm sorry, but it would be to have those people think about those things that they take for granted, that they believe are productive and progressist when they're not, and they need to be actually put under the microscope and be shown that they're not neutral and they are very much exclusive. Even this concept, that is at the very basis of the, I don't know how much you know about the French context, but this idea of universalism is the number one concept in France. And no one will ever question that, because in theory, it is actually, but in practice, it has been a non-universal principle from the beginning. And this needs to be talked about. This is not neutral. This is charged. And this is being manipulated in order to continue to reinforce the system. And so in a sense, yes, and as I said earlier on, we cannot reach the far right. It's almost impossible to enter a dialogue that would be productive based on that. We are just too far apart, and that's maybe I'm being defeatist, but I don't think so. It's more people who, in a way, are what we call a bit bien-pensants. I don't know how we say that in English, really bien-pensants. We're convinced to be humanist and that to be open and so on. When yet they don't see the limitation to their own understanding of what it is to be French and so on. People were trying to reach here. Am I addressing part of your point here? And that in the US is different in the sense that I don't need in the US I don't need to convince anyone of the importance of race in the everyday life. Not to say that it's a better context overall in the US, not at all, but it's a completely different approach. Right now we are fighting to put race on the table as a tool indispensable to understand what is happening. It's not something that I have to do in the US. That is probably the biggest difference in terms of how you approach the discussion between the two leftist part of the population. Do you agree?
But maybe just one short
sure.
Remark to add, because precisely in the US I think one can perceive the use of these terms of diversity, representation, minority. What does it even mean, to speak of diversity? What is diverse in that context? And then you're already in the kind of the loop of talking again about certain
right.
Racial. So of course you're not getting out. You need to first of all get some awareness of it, or
yeah.
So on the compte.
Oui.
So and it's at the same time I think it also emphasized what Gabriel said earlier, that these discourses on diversity first they often fall back in or rehash some essentialist discourses, sure. Some essentialist concepts of culture
sure.
/ race. And second, they also conceal actual economic privileges and economic differences, which yep. I think, even if one looks at the democratic, the liberals these days and their presidential candidates, you have candidates who are technically they check all the boxes in terms of diversity, but they're coming from highly privileged sure. Social classes, and
yeah, sure.
It is something that completely falls in oblivion.
That's the chapter in the book about Lilian Thuram, who is one of the leading anti-racist activists in France. He's a former player from that '98 team, who then became very engaged in anti-racist struggles. And we were a bit harsh on Thuram, and sometimes I feel a bit bad. But it was to this point exactly. That even many of the most anti-racist discourses in France fall back to this idea of integration. In France, we have this idea of integration as opposed to the multicultural understanding of the nation in the US. Integration means accepting many of the mechanisms that we're trying to highlight and denounce as exclusive in the way they function. So I agree with you. And in the French context, it's this idea of not questioning the tenets of the model, universalism and integration. Okay, for integration, it's the idea that you have to integrate, to assimilate to a already fixed model. And no one is going to question whether this model can be changed, can be remodeled based on the reality of the demographics. You have to accept what is French culture as such and leave aside your own differences in order to embrace what is defined as being French and therefore superior. So that's the problem for us as well. But the book was in order to pause and show that those principles. Models indeed are all connotated and therefore needs to be questioned. All of them, from the most obvious to the most abstract and accepted one, which is some of the tenets of the French model. That was the idea here. Yeah.
I think Ine maybe was up next.
Thank you. I really enjoyed reading I read the English overview, but I really enjoyed reading the book because I like to see how the theory applies to reality. So like each case studies, I think were for me really interesting.
No, thank you. I appreciate it.
But my question has to do with the inverse relations. So I don't know that much about French politics or the culture as much as you do or as other people do. And so I guess this is a question to everyone and not just the book author. But I'm interested in whether, if you know these case studies better, whether the case studies can help us rethink Barth's mythology, because I am of the position that no theory can capture reality in all its complexity.
Okay.
And so Barth represents to us a system, kind of a hermitly sealed society of systems, but there may be cracks in the system, and perhaps the case studies from the ground show how that theory is perhaps not the best representation of the world. So I'm wondering if all of you know other examples, and you too know the other examples of how these cases challenge and problematize the theory.
I'm curious to hear about if people have examples in their own context of those signs that...
and I'm thinking it specifically in terms of resistance, and this doesn't have to be the only one, because like Foucault is accused of saying that power is everywhere, and there are people who are interested in resistance. So I'm wondering how these signs perhaps are being redeployed to resist this hermitly sealed system.
Barth talks about the possibility of a myth at the second degree, which is so you have the sign that is being seized by the myth, and the possibility to rework the myth in order to produce a second myth based on the first one that would be considered to be resisting or countering the effect of the first myth. That's a bit what we talk about in the chapter about the street signs. This idea of the first chapter is about the signs that bear the name of colonial figures in France. They're everywhere in Paris, and when you take different streets around you, many of them are named after big colonial figures. And the idea of that, so of course it's a street sign, but the connotation about the greatness of the empire and those figures who helped build what we call the Good of France. So they do disseminate a myth about this glorious French past being tied up to the colonial times. But with the idea of the debate being about precising on the street signs who those people were, informing the people like you who were walking around what they did and why they're being celebrated, would be a way to resist the first myth by creating a second myth that would kind of neutralize the first one. So Barth gives, I believe, open the doors to the possibility of what you are talking about. It does not develop. And of course, the old part at the end, Myth Today, was written afterwards. It was trying to systematize a little bit the work it's been doing for years on a more periodical way, and it's full of tensions and contradictions. But it is aware, I think, of that, and it gives you tools to rethink and to pursue the conversation based on the tools he was trying to put forward, knowing that he never said it precisely, but he was never also very happy with the way this turned. He tried to rewrite different myths later on, and then he stopped. He wrote another theoretical piece where he attacked some of the parts. So a very imperfect system. But yet we believe very productive in the way that it just a basic way of approaching everyday life, of being able to pause and to decipher the signs that surround you. He's not the only one doing that, of course, but he was one of the first and one of, I think, of the most interesting. Can we engage the text in a way that allows us to grasp the politically charged connotations that basically carry us through every time we open the door? Even if it's just that, I believe that Barth is important for this. If you start digging, you will see maybe less satisfying aspects of it. Do you have an example of what you were trying?
That's why I asked.
Okay. I'm curious about that. Yeah. Maybe something will come up later on.
I think otherwise Matt in the back.
Thank you. My question is about, you mentioned at the start how the sort of like post-colonial questions are much less on the agenda in France than in the States.
Right.
And you also said sort of post-2005, there's been more sort of interest in this sort of thing.
Yeah.
I guess I was curious, I know in Lydie's case, this is probably, there's some engagement with work from the Anglophone Academy that you're bringing sort of back to France, and I guess I want to ask if you could speak more about sort of the reception of some of this Anglophone work within France, and if there's any links between what's happening in these academic spaces and maybe some of these ideas that you're taking up by anti-racist works here in France, and if there's more new work in French academy.
So it's a good question. The main text have been translated into English and are being used in France, starting with Said's Orientalism all the way to what's being done today, including Stoller and so on. But they're not necessarily that being used that much, to be honest, because we have quite a few French Francophone theorists that have also contributed greatly, that being used a lot, starting with Fanon and Césaire, and more recently people like Achille Mbembe and so on in Africa. Those are recurring figures. People who teach in Paris also, Pape Ndiaye was more on the history side of things. People from the Achag group, Achag ACH, are historians who did a great deal of work in order to put forward those issues at the turn of the century. But I would say that people in France tend to quote more on the Francophone side of things than in English. But texts are translated. I've seen people using Baba, for instance, and this idea of third space is very popular in France as well. And although all the big names, do you have anything in mind that? No. Okay. Yeah, so that's the main ones are. But again, people don't always read that much in English, in French, and quoting from the French version is not always ideal. People rely a lot on what's been done in the French context.
And I guess just a follow-up is see much of the. I'm thinking in this case of like François Vergès. It's kind of like French theory happening here, getting taken back to the States and having some influence.
Yes.
There.
To some degree.
For example.
Yeah, to some degree. We use that. Yeah, Vergès. Interesting point, because Vergès is one of the few theorists in France to use the term decolonial, which we talked about. The decolonial is something that is very prevalent in other parts of the world, especially in South America, for instance, with theorists such as we talked about Mignolo the other day. Not in Francophone post-colonial studies. So Vergès is one of the few to use the term decolonial. She's very active on that. She just published a book on decolonial feminism, and that is being quite popular in the US right now. So several talks organized around that book. So yes, she's one of the few, I would say, to have made the jump and being quite popular on the other side. Otherwise, people in the US tend to rely more on English-speaking theories. It's a little bit separated, yeah. But yeah, thank you for the example, because our book is I would say, very close to the decolonial side of things, yet still within post-colonial, in my opinion. And maybe we'll get to this point where if you are interested in decolonial, you can tell me what you think about this. But she's the only one right now to publish on that, and also to organize activities and manifestation on that. She had an art expo on this. She's involved also with music and different things. She's the only one. And maybe because of this intensity in her engagement, she's being picked up in the US as well, I would say. Yeah. But she's part of the book we just finished editing on the site of memory. She wrote a chapter in that on the politics of France as it relates to control of birth in the colonies. They would control birth, and they would actually import kids for adoption, forcing that. So she has a chapter on that book, so she's playing on different fields like that, and yeah, very interesting theories. Yeah.
Can I just, as a follow-up, could you clarify how, because there are a million different definitions of post-colonial, decolonial thought, etc.
Yeah.
Just to clarify that, how would you define post-colonial studies and the heritage that you identify with, and maybe then also decolonial theory?
Yeah. Going back to the definition by Stoller on aphasia, I would say this idea of looking at contemporary France from the prism of the colonial, the enduring legacy of the colonial, basically. Right. That would be the most simple definition by which I abide, I would say. Yeah. That's
and then decolonial theory, you would... I mean, these are loose terms, you know, sort of.
I would see decolonial as a much more politically engaged thing than although this is clearly, I would, decolonial has actually a political party in France. Les Indigènes de la République. republics, indigenous people. They're very engaged activists who I would say quite extreme in their discourse about post-colonial France. That's where I put the line in terms of the level of political commitment to which we abide, I would say.
Okay. Okay.
That would probably be the limit for me. Yeah.
Well, this might come up again. I think
Yeah.
Wayne is next.
I'm really sympathetic with your criticisms of multiculturalism.
Yeah.
And I also get confused, however, when I think about it in European context. So I'm from Canada,
Okay.
Turtle Island, and the most incisive criticism of multiculturalism there is the indigenous critique, which is that even if there was a perfect functioning multicultural pluralistic society, it would nonetheless be predicated not only on the historic but the ongoing theft of indigenous territory.
Okay.
Thus isn't as utopian as we once presumed.
Okay.
So that is all very clear to me, at least.
Yeah.
But when I think about this criticism in colonial contexts, not settler colonial contexts, but colonial ones such as here, and also consider the fact that the indigenous people here are the problem and not the solution per se,
Yeah.
I get very confused. So in what would you say is like the normative core to the anti-multicultural, anti-liberal democratic utopian vision here in a colonial context?
The core would be, so basically the opposite of this would be the longing for a homogeneous nation, right? Which was never the case in France, but which has been seriously under tension since the change of demographics happening after World War II. But yes, to go back to your point, there is no multicultural society in France officially, right? In practice, we have, in official terms, does not exist because, again, race doesn't exist, technically, officially, and only French culture is provided as a model to assimilate into. So the core of this anti-diversity discourse, to the question, right, would be this idea of how is it possible to, despite the change in demographics, finding a way to keep some type of homogeneous understanding of Frenchness, which is impossible racially, but which people are pushing for culturally, through the idea of assimilation, which was, of course, an important tenet of colonial discourse, right? When France justified its invasion of the colonies by the need to civilize backwards population, by bringing the lights of French culture, and so on. So they're trying to reproduce this in France today by maintaining this idea of the possibility of a rigid, homogeneous French culture that would not integrate differences, but that would just erase it or compress it to the point where, as the film shows, in the end, nothing changes. Does it answer the question? The idea of homogeneity, the longing for homogeneity as the building rock of the French nation. Yeah?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead if you have follow-up. Don't hesitate.
Oh yeah, can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
So Roland Barthes is like the pivotal figure
Yeah.
in your,
Yeah.
so like what do you think, I haven't read the French, but
Yeah.
what do you think about his racism? Have you interrogated that in the text?
Yeah, so
Because
people, yeah.
it's pretty
Yeah.
clear in Camera Lucida.
Yeah. So Lydie, my colleague, just finished an article where she studies the use of the word Negro in mythologies. Because if you look at the myth today, it uses the word nègre, I believe 60-something times, which is an enormous amount of time, for a period where the term nègre was already not really acceptable anymore. So she addresses that. Yes, you know that Barthes was an interesting figure. His grandfather was a very famous colonial administrator. He was in charge of Côte d'Ivoire, I believe, for quite a few years. When he died, he was afforded national funerals for his work in the colonies. He has a city named after him, Bingerville. So Barthes grew up in a very interesting environment where the colonies were far from being necessarily something to be critiqued. He tried to distance himself from this, but it does show up in his writing as well. Mythologies, yes. Also in texts like Incident, when he writes about his life in Morocco. He was a teacher in Morocco, wrote about it. in particular his sexual encounters with young Arab boys, in a way that is also quite disturbing. So for us, we didn't touch that because the concept was the theoretical idea of myth, while being aware of the issues with Barthes' own position, right? And the fact that there is still much more to do with mythologies from a colonial standpoint. Several mythologies deal directly with the colonial. You have Grammaire africaine, Bichon chez les nègres, I have a few, La Grande Famille des Hommes. They all engage with the colonial, but all probably in a problematic way, which was not the idea in the book, but we need to be aware of that, because he is far from being untouched by the discourse that he was trying to critique himself. He was also in a big part of it. And he also participated into the spread of those issues by trying to counter the discourse. So that's a good point. And there is much more to be done. Barthes as a colonial guy was only discovered in the late 90s, basically. Several UK academics, Alec Hargreaves, Diana Knight, Jane Hiddleston, all show that Barthes, the colonial, played a big part in Barthes' thinking. But Barthes was died in 1980, and took 20 years for people to start looking at this with the rise of postcolonial studies, and there's still much more to be done on that. Not to indict him, but to be aware of his shortcomings on the question as well. I think the concept works well. The attitude is also problematic.
I think Antoine's up next.
Yes, thank you very much. I enjoyed very much reading the chapter.
Thanks.
One of the kind of critical strategy that you're using in this chapter is to point to a contradiction between the so-called universal values of republicanism and what is being achieved in practice.
Yeah.
And in fact, the kind of the mythical reproduction of society is always a kind of a striving to erase that contradiction.
Yeah.
Hence the kind of second nature that is constitutive of those societies, essentially bourgeois. My question is very broad, so it's also a question for everyone. I was wondering if you think that this idea of contradiction between a given set of norms in a given society and the practices that sustain and contribute to reproduce those norms, whether this idea of contradiction is useful to understand the ways in which minorities, individuals, and collective, the way in which they struggle. So, and do you think it's useful to kind of frame our understanding of that struggle, or do you think it's dangerous? Because obviously, if we think that there is that it's the case that individuals and groups use a kind of contradiction between norms and practice, then I think we face two options.
Okay.
Either we think, well, what they want is a kind of reformism, so let's just realize better our given norms, or they're just caught in a kind of ideological trap. So I was, do you see what I'm...
Yeah. Well, I was wondering, what do you see, the two paths, what do you see, what's in the film in practice?
I don't have an example in the film, but I was thinking of, there was this example that came out yesterday. There is this Algerian footballer who scored a goal, and he responded on Twitter to a French politician saying, "Oh, this is our friends," or something like that.
Okay.
So obviously minorities, they also have, I mean, it's part of their normative claims to present what they think could be a potential vision of France.
Yeah.
And should we be worried of that? I mean, should we say, oh, there might be some ideology there, they don't really know their kind of conditions, or, I don't know.
Yeah, so this is a kind of a new topic in France, with the second and third generations of French people who are now claiming the right to hang on to their cultural heritage and as being a legit part of Frenchness. So this started to arise in, I don't know, in 80s, late 80s. I don't see it as a threat. I see it as a normal evolution of the social pact and the social model. It is ideological, it is political, everything is. And therefore, we need to accept it. I accept it in the sense that, again, it goes back to this idea of questioning the tenets of the actual model in a way that will allow us to live together in a more efficient way. So to this extent, I am absolutely okay with this. And the film shows the opposite, right? The film shows people who are not willing to actually put forward their differences and to have them accepted as legit. They show them as being happy to put them aside in order to embrace the current model. So the film shows the exact opposite in order to reassure the people who are questioning what is the future of this model.
Because we were speaking of universalism, and I understand the kind of historicizing critique of universalism,
Yeah.
but there is a sense in which, I mean, if we take agents seriously, so individuals and groups, minorities, oppressed minorities, I think, I don't know, obviously I cannot speak for them, but I think it's reasonable to claim that part of their struggle is to be able to point somehow to certain norms, which are to be considered as, let's say, the achievements of modernity somehow.
Okay.
Say, look, this society presents, offers itself as progressive, as free, and what have you, and in fact, it isn't. So something must be valuable in the kind of given set of norms. And I was wondering, should we kind of bracket that radically and say, no, we need a kind of completely new understanding of freedom and equality, or should we say no, let's just hold on to what we consider valuable, and then just, I mean, it's a different kind of, I suppose.
Because what's the idea of progressive change as opposed to radical rethinking of the nation's basic sustenance, right? I understand what you're saying, and I agree that I think that we need the progressive aspect with certain norms being productive is understandable. In the specific terms of case of universalism, it's the impossibility to even have words to engage with the issue that is a problem. And going back to Stoller's definition, the occlusion of the very basic vocabulary to talk about those issues is where we are right now in France, prevented by such things as universalism. The idea of race is again, I keep going back to this because it's the most obvious one. We cannot talk about race, there's no words for it, there's no distance for it, how do you engage racism if you cannot talk about this? And that connects back to this idea of universalism and to this unquestioned sense of it. So maybe some norms are needed in order to function together, but the most important ones right now are preventing us from moving forward in that sense, right? Back to language, There is no, we struggle in the text because we live in the US and it would come to us in English all the time and we're like, how do you say that in French? We're both French, right? We just could not find the words to talk about it. Because they exist, but they are not part of the debate, they are not accepted, they are considered always between question mark. This is where we are right now, right? So those norms are even preventing from able to express the issue, leave alone moving past them. Do you see where it's hampering you?
And do you think that we should, as social theorists or philosopher or historian, and this is a question, I mean, for myself, it's an important one. Do you think that we should strive to understand the element of universality? Part of the struggle maybe is to be able to point, look, this is our sense of universality somehow. So the critique of universalism, they are right in a sense, but they should be dialectical. So I don't know.
I think it's a good point, I'm having a hard time seeing which ones we could hang on to right now, given the situation that we have. And but I agree, we should be able to pinpoint to those moments or elements that allow us to build on.
Maybe the idea of language and the kind of struggle for expression.
That could be a start, Without going back to back, but without the basic idea of signs, what signifier, how do you engage this? This is where Bart again is interesting, going back to the basics of deconstructing this and finding the content of the sign, being able to engage with it in different ways. We can talk about this later if you want. It's interesting. I'd like to ask your opinion about, because you used to know the French context as well. So a bit of a cynical take on all of this, right? So I need a bit of someone where we can actually hang on to this. This is good. I'm having a hard time seeing that right now.
And even the critique of regression, the critique of progress is always to point to, the category of progress historically has been built on regressive tendencies. But there is a sense in which we do that in the name of something like in the idea of progress. Because if we had no idea of progress in the first place, then we wouldn't be able to pinpoint to what is wrong or right. So I understand. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. It's very interesting.
There's arguably a universalism in phenomenon too. It's a universalism in Césaire. I mean, Césaire in the mid-20th century argued for becoming French citizens as part of a département. I mean, now it's a very different, radical politically. It's very different today. So I mean, maybe if we can kind of historicize, universalism when and how. I mean, I think Zapatistas have their own sort of notion of universalism, maybe, you know. A world in which many worlds fit is a kind of universalism.
But that needs to evolve,
there are
right?
many kinds of universalisms.
Yeah. And the one right now is we don't have time right now, but we need to go back to Haiti, and Haiti being the context where those ideas have been implemented in a way that I believe were a lot more successful ideologically than they were in France. People who've studied the Haitian Revolution all agree that to say that the ideas of the revolution has been actually happened in Haiti and never actually in France. And this is where studying the context are so important, because they built a constitution in a nation that was, actually to some degree post-racial right away in 1804. They hang on to the actual essence and content of the revolution's ideals in a way that we never have in France. And their universalism is, I think, a lot more productive than the one we developed to our friends. So it's possible to look at other places, and this idea of rigidity in France, it's rigid. French people, the stereotype about being snobbish, and to this it's clear. I mean, people believe that they have achieved the real universalism. I live in the US, and there's so many issues in the US, but the Americans understand that their democracy is an ongoing project, right? That is never perfect. It needs to advance. They understand that, and it takes time, and it's too long because if you suffer from racism, you don't have time for this. But it's always ongoing. It's never in France. We nailed it. Bam.
1789.
That's
Done.
it. Boom. As you're saying, it needs to evolve, right? To take into consideration the different context. And the fact that we discard Haiti from discussion, I think, is disastrous on many levels, including on that level. Dialogue with them and what they achieved in the early 19th century, and what they have writers in the late 90s as well that come up with texts that we still haven't done in France centuries later, on equality of between races and so on. But it's not part of the dialogue, and because Haiti has been cast aside, and we hang on to our.
Just as a quick follow-up, the Haitian Declaration of Independence is fantastic because it contrasts starkly with the French Declaration. And one of the things that it insists on is actually the particularism of the Haitian people, who are declaring war on the hypocrisy of the false universality of the French people, who have subjected them more with their lies and their rhetoric than with their armies and their soldiers. It's a fantastic read, but segues very nicely with precisely some of the things we were highlighting.
And you talk about the silence. This is not part of the school program, to understand. No one in France studies the Haitian Revolution. It's impossible to understand the French Revolution without the Haitian Revolution. It's impossible. And yet, it is never discussed.
Yep.
An example of the silence that has some terrible effects on.
And if it is discussed, it's in terms of European diffusionism, where what the Haitians did is they just tried to enact some of the principles from the French context. They weren't thinking on their own. They weren't doing anything new. In spite of the fact that they also inscribed women within the declaration, so it's haïtien et haïtienne, which of course you didn't have in France. Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done on that front. Yeah, I think Gustavo is up next, and then I know there's a few.
Yes, my question builds upon a remark that Lawrence made in his question. So this idea that the discourse of race can be used to obliterate class exploitation. There's a really good book by Toni Morrison. It's a novel. It's called Mercy, a novel. And it's really interesting because Morrison in that book reconstructs the emergence of the discourse of race in the Americas. And she argues, right, but she did a lot of historical work to argue this, that the discourse of race was invented in one colony, I think it's Massachusetts, I might be wrong, one British colony in North America, which was, and it was forged precisely in order to camouflage class exploitation. I think in Massachusetts, it's one of the colonies, I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's this one. In the 1600s, the African slaves and the majority of the white have-nots gathered and fought together side by side, and they took control of the government of this colony. And the landowners were really scared in the other colonies also, And for a few days, they managed to control the government, but then they were repressed. And right after that, this colony created a law saying that any white citizen, any white person, could kill someone who was of African heritage, and wouldn't be persecuted for that. And this law was created precisely to instill distrust amongst the have-nots. So then they wouldn't unite and struggle against the powerful farmers. And so my question is, so since you're really keen on introducing the discourse of race in this country, how would you prevent such a discourse from being appropriated for that purpose, to camouflage class exploitation? I don't know, I know that if you compare France and the US, I'm not really, I mean, you probably know these two contexts much better than I do. But I'd say, I mean, from what I know, I'd say that the working class in this country has been able to mobilize much more effectively than in the US. I don't know, I might be wrong. And I think maybe, would you say that maybe the absence of the discourse of race could be a reason for that? One of the reasons, right, for that. So.
One of them. Because, yeah, I mean, you're right, this is a complex matter, and the film actually shows the inverse. So the film shows that the discourse on class in the film trumps race, right, as the wealthy minorities suddenly do not become minorities anymore because they access a certain level of bourgeois living that basically erases their racial differences. So interesting, based on your question. It is possible to engage in those issues from an intersection standpoint, and we constantly do that. I think that Gabriel has an interesting point about this on the Gilets jaunes, what is happening, and the fact that minorities were not part of the movement, or the banlieue were not part of the movement at the time, or when they were, there was no racial revendication in that movement, that there was only a class issue that was being put forward, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated, you know, because there's the Gilets Noirs as well, and all the things that have been going on lately with, you know, organizing around.
Yeah.
But I think the question, if I understand it, is how racialization has been historically used to divide the working classes, right? Yeah. And there's an enormous body of literature on that, so I'd be curious. If I don't want to.
No, that's the question.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do we use for this? You want me to tell us the theoretician that we are interested, or our take on the issue itself?
No, my point is, because in your talk you said, okay, this is a problem, right? If I understood you correctly.
Yeah.
France has not adopted the discourse of race, and this is a problem, and I want to introduce this topic here. So my question is, since you want to introduce this discourse here, how would you prevent this discourse from being used as it has been used in other countries to camouflage class exploitation? Maybe, I don't know, just read the two lessons you assigned for this talk, maybe in other words you address this issue.
Yeah. It's interesting. One way to do that from at the very early stage is just to associate. We don't have, in France, we don't have statistics, for instance. Because since race doesn't exist, there is no numbers in terms of showing economic disparities, for instance, between minorities and people who form the majority. It starts with having intersection between race and social disparity being tightly connected and being impossible to escape given the actual context. It starts with the over-representation of minorities in the banlieue tied to their economic struggles, the impossibility to access employment, housing, and to move out the banlieue. It's possible to keep the two together, to show that the strong correlation between the two, in order to keep class as part of discussion tightly connected to race. You see what I mean? It's possible to do that. We don't have the tools to do it in France like people have in the US. Even though apparently the government is moving forward a little bit, allowing some statistics to be taken in order to understand the issues. But it's interesting because I don't see how it could be a problem right now in France, given where we are. You see what I mean? How introducing race to discussion right now could end up being what you're saying. I'm having a hard time seeing at the present moment, how and when it could become this problematic.
Do you think if it wasn't a hypothetical
Yeah.
question, it's a hard question,
Yeah.
I'm just like,
Yeah.
thinking right now, but do you think that if this became, let's say the census in this country adopt
Yeah.
division of race,
Yeah.
do you think that I know that a right-wing politician like Marine Le Pen could not use this discourse to attract, I don't know, poor white voters, and I don't know, it's just like a,
Yeah.
like a
No, of course you could.
of course, this is all
Yeah.
hypothetical.
Yeah.
Just say that.
That's interesting because of course.
Just beware, I'm just trying to
Yeah.
like change the perspective
Yeah,
here, because
it's interesting.
maybe the absence of the discourse of race.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that this is perfect, right?
Yeah.
But maybe the absence of this discourse can have its benefits. And I think maybe.
Yeah, so because it might. It might. I would argue still that the issue with it are greater than the benefits they can bring, but it might. I'm having a hard time saying how it's possible. We need to maybe discuss this a bit further afterwards, with concrete examples. But
There are plenty of other questions we can keep moving. Oh, now there's even more hands. I think
let's maybe
Louisa,
follow,
and then I'll not. Louisa, I think you're up next, and then I see a few more hands. Yeah.
My question was sort of partially answered by Anton's question. So we should.
I think Hannah, you're next. If
Yeah.
that, yeah.
I recently saw the exhibit, the Musée d'Orsay, about the black model.
Yeah.
And I was really struck by it, just by the sheer profusion of images that it presented. It's a really vast exhibit. And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts about what kind of contribution an exhibition like this is making, or any sort of response.
Yeah, so I'm planning on going tomorrow. I haven't seen it yet, but.
Yeah, and I would also open the question to anyone else who's interested in the exhibit or has seen it.
So what do you think of it in terms of the risk of exoticism is always there? Do you think that it was well done?
I mean, I thought it was incredibly interesting, and I was especially interested in some of the material about Haiti and the abolition movement in France. I think the risk of, sort of like exoticizing gays proliferates because of the number of objects and because of the sort of like light way in which the entire exhibition was framed. So to me, it came across as a project mainly of simply showing these figures, these models. In many cases, research had been done to name them, to like find out a little bit of information about their lives and their connections to the artists who painted them.
Okay.
But to my mind, it didn't go very far beyond that, and some of the contemporary responses incorporated. By the time the exhibit reached the 30s to the 50s, it's a really vast historical range.
Right.
There's a real turn towards the States and to sort of like the French artists' engagement with the Harlem Renaissance currents and the avant-garde in the United States. So I found that turn really interesting. And found it didn't really speak to sort of contemporary France.
Yeah, so it all depends on the discourse that is being tied up to those exhibitions, right? The exposition itself is absolutely fine, but and they are very popular. Every time you have this type of expos, they are always full. The problem is that it all depends, of course, how it's done and whether or not they manage to implement this post-colonial perspective that I believe is key to understanding the production of those paintings and so on. Are they contextualized? Do we have a discussion about Orientalism part of it? Or it's just a display of the black model throughout history that people will consume as myth, basically, without being able to make sense of that. I need to go to, I'm going tomorrow and I will be able to then maybe tell you what I see. But the silence about the question is not in terms of we never see expositions. It's always there. There's a very profuse discourse on race in France. It's always how it's framed, to which purpose, and what do people understand about that. Whether they go to exposition, whether they go see Qu'est-ce qu'on a fait au bon Dieu, it's there for you. But so far, it's been rarely done in a necessarily productive way. Françoise Vergès has done it in the Louvre, in a clearly decolonial approach that I think hit the target on black bodies and the consumption by the European gaze. That's not always the case. So I don't know about if Orsay, maybe not apparently from what you say. maybe a little bit short.
Ian, Ralph, did you want to respond immediately to
Yeah,
or?
You
I was
went there,
just gonna
Alfred.
say,
Or,
okay, so I saw it in New York and I saw it here. Very different
Yeah.
exhibits, and so the differences were kind of interesting. And I guess I won't go into it now, other people have questions. Here, but just very quickly, here, it's the history of France, and so that was very interesting, and there was much less contemporary stuff. So in New York, there's more contemporary stuff. In New York, it was much more focused on what I would call the erratic literary figures.
Okay.
Jean Duval, and, the two women, the black model for Manet.
Okay.
So the artistic and literary figures,
Okay.
and you don't have the huge historical background, and more contemporary stuff. And so here is more historical.
Amy, did you want
I
to?
see.
I wanted to respond to your point. So I also thought it was really interesting that it wasn't as radical as I thought it would be. It felt like a history lesson showing how, like the authors all titled them Nick, but the directors of the exhibition tried really hard not to call them Nick, so they renamed the pictures saying the men and the women. So I agree.
Formally known.
Yeah. So I agree with you that it was not as radical as I wanted it to be, but something that I really appreciated is I have two examples. So they helped me revisit the really famous French artists because we think they're really great and we admire their pictures. But one example that was given was the image of Anka. I don't know how to pronounce it.
Yeah, that's it.
Anka. He was trying to draw a devil, and to sketch the devil, he had an image of a black model. And so he was obviously connecting the blacks with devils, and so he assigned his student, whose name starts with C, to do the sketches to help him. And so the student drew this image of the devil, not knowing that he had based it off of a devil. And so that was one instance in which it allows us to challenge the idea that these grand historical figures are great.
So this was explained as part of the exhibit.
Yes, it was heavily explained. And then the other one that I found really interesting was an image of both nude, so two women. One was black woman sitting down like this, another white woman, she was like this. And so then the explanation said that it was an excuse for this author, the artist, Jerome, to show women in a nude pose. And so he was obviously treating a very controversial, important political subject, but it was an excuse to draw a woman naked. So I really appreciated the explanations of the curators for explaining the history and the kind of ideas behind it. So I thought that it did a little more than just giving new names to back titles, but I do agree.
I agree. There was a lot that I really appreciated at the exhibit, and I think what struck me most was just the vast size. So for me, that had positive and negative effects. Like on the one hand, I've never seen so many faces of people of color in a museum anywhere. On the other hand, it was a sort of overwhelming amount of images to figure out how to do it.
That's interesting.
Now, I think we only have 10 minutes left. There are 3 other questions. Maybe we can group them together and have you give us a final response, and we'll try to keep everything tight. I think it's Spencer, Romel, and Alejo. So.
Yeah. So just real quick, picking up on a couple of threads of people asking questions about myth and struggle, and the political uses of myth, and how we can best engage, and if you see the political use of myth as deconstructing the mythologies that have been built up, and I guess the example that I want to bring up is it just happened over the weekend that a 69-year-old anarchist named Willem Buns Bronson attacked an ICE facility in Washington State and was shot and killed by the cops. And he, in his final note, talked about how he was inspired by John Brown and inspired by Emma Goldman, and was drawing upon this counter myth of individuals and collectives in the United States fighting for freedom and justice. And so what this kind of maybe counter myth or counter history can do versus how you responded to Innie's question earlier about a secondary myth. And so how you see myths being productive for political struggle.
I think Ramel and Alejo.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah,
if we
it's
group
okay,
them?
it's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, the scholars and intellectuals have the tendency to naturalize their privileged position as critic. Somebody who knows a lot, somebody who's intellectually very capable. So that tends to reflect, for example, when we analyze things that there is a need, for example, to change the mindset so that you change the mindset will change the behavior, and then the result will be a better future. So that's the usual kind of things. Now I wonder if because this kind of tendency among intellectuals, it might also hinder the way how they understand the problem. Because looking at it from the privileged analytic standpoint, okay, we might be missing things like, for example, when you analyze the film, when you predict the people, the 12 million people, or whoever who watch them, and you say that they're like that, they're supposed to be like this. So we already have the kind of presumption that our standpoint is the better standpoint,
Right.
which makes me wonder if a kind of critique could also be some form of a myth in a Barthian sense. And also, I'm wondering if, to what extent in your work as a critical scholar, you have accommodated that kind of possibility that perhaps the truly radical critical theory will entail criticizing the very idea of critique.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So, and to what extent really it might be affecting your work?
Yeah,
That's great. And Alejo?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to sort of pick up also what has been said, also in the past few weeks. Like, for instance, I think I just kind of wanted to trace a line of demarcation between, and kind of have you say a thing or two about it, between like kind of this kind of nostalgic sense of like we've lost this working class identity, which I think Gabriel and Lorenz and Gustavo sort of, you know, in a way arguing for. Which to me I read as kind of nostalgia of like, oh, we have had this working class identity, but it's been lost because of many reasons. And it's another argument within the Marxist left, even the Black internationalist left, from C.L.R. James to so that's one position. The other position is a kind of position of even the Afro-pessimists who would say that there's nothing, or some would say that this has nothing to do with capitalism. And I think there's a third position which says something like more like racial capitalism, in which race and class are what I like to call sort of relatively autonomous, right? There's a relative autonomy of race which cannot be reduced to class and a relative, and so on, right? And so the question becomes not about emphasizing some primary identity which is better than others in terms of articulating some sense of a mass, right? Either one which we lost or one which is ascendant and which particularizes all of us. So the question is, for me, is how is it that we articulate these singularities into something around the myth, maybe a counter myth, that does not subsume them and therefore, in a way, subsume them under a single abstract universal which homogenizes them all, right? Which would be, unless people have another sense of class, a radically expansive sense of class, which I think is put forward, radically expansive sense of class, it seems like it's nothing more than nostalgia to go back to something that's been lost, right? And it also kind of doesn't help in terms of actual practical struggle, right? Because the ways in which racialization works in the US and maybe Brazil, right? Brazil abolished slavery in 1888 and world citizens after that. There's a similar thing maybe happening in Brazil. I don't know what Gustavo thinks about that, but so I'm just saying that maybe there's a third way of thinking about it, which is thinking about the relative autonomy of, let's say, race and class, rather than either we've lost working class identity, we have to go back to it, or this sort of proliferation of, let's just all be ourselves, a radical singularity. So this is kind of the debate that we also had around Deleuze and Foucault and the debate about intellectuals. So anyway, maybe that was not part of the discussion, but other people were part of it. So if you could sort of maybe say a thing or two about, how this is kind of the broader, I think to me, problems that we're all thinking through here, politically too, right?
Where's talked about this, just to get a sense where you're coming from?
Sorry?
Where's talked about this in the seminar? Just to get a sense.
Well, so first is the debate between sort of the dialogue between Deleuze and Foucault on the role of intellectuals, the function of intellectuals should be local, particular, and so on, is the way in which we sort of presented it. I think to me is the sort of, the question is how do we articulate the singularities without assuming them under an abstract universal, or rather than in maybe their own singularity, we can also work in difference together. So I mean, that's the concept of relative autonomy for me is important, because it doesn't subsume one under the other, and it maintains their singularity, while also allows for an articulation too, right? Rather than pausing some. Does that make sense?
I think I see.
Just a few lines there, but
So
5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Should be easy.
You know, Barthes was heavily criticized for this lack of engagement in beyond his writings, right? He was never part of any real struggle beyond, for instance, his take on war in Algeria never went further than mythology, talking about the expropriation of the Algerian by the French in order to produce wine, for example. So, and Wole Soyinka, African thinker, also criticized him for just speaking about the issue and never upon the issue, and hence just producing a mythic discourse that was basically useless. Clearly, I don't subscribe to this, but I see commitment in refusing the passive consumer role that society ascribes us in terms of being able to pose and decipher what is given as norms and what Barthes said, ce qui va de soi, what goes without saying, which is the most dangerous thing in terms of ideology. So in terms of struggle and commitment, I think that just accepting the role of mythologue is to me an act of a strong political magnitude in itself. Not even engaging in an act like you just described, that of course is going all the way in a way. I think that what Barthes proposes, and for us to accept it, is one. Now, it has its limits, and to your point, and Barthes was very much aware of this, right? There has to be a mythology of the mythologue itself. It's indispensable. We talked about, I think we left, or this idea of Barthes on shortcomings with race. The choices we make in terms of mythologies and how we engage them need to be themselves subject to critical discourse that will show our own tensions, contradictions. Your point about the place of race was important. I'm stuck on this because I don't have taken enough time to think about the possibility of the other side of the argument. I am so drawn to the idea that, yes, to me there's no doubt that this needs to be part of the discussion, that I need to pause and see in which way I myself reinforce maybe the system by refusing to look at the other side of things and the issues coming with this idea of pushing race as part of the institution. So I see the two together as important, but Barthes was talking about at the end of the essay, right, of his place in society, the solitude of the mythologue, who looks at things from the outside and is never fully part of it. Therefore, he was questioning his own ability to change things, his own engagement, the terms of it, and asking for someone to do the job that you're talking about. This idea of we need to do a mythology of the mythologue, whether it's Barthes or all of us. But to me, it does not prevent a strong form of commitment. Do you agree with that, or do you see what I mean? I don't see a tremendous need or urge to go beyond accepting this role that Barthes offers us. Would you accept that as well? Or?
I mean, mine is more about like creating like counter mythologies versus consisting the.
Yeah. So in that case, the exposition that we're talking about is a good example of this, right? Because the painting itself is a great vehicle of myth, but the way it's being organized and the discourse produced upon it is a way to produce a counter myth discourse. So it's being done like this. I hope that the book is doing that. It is possible. The street signs being explained to us, that's an example of that, of commitment and producing secondary myth that neutralize the first one. I think it's very much possible. People don't always accept that, but I see that, manageable. And that I think is the first step in order to, we keep saying in French studies, we need to decolonize the imaginary. But that I think to me is the first step. It's not the only one, but it is, in my opinion, a productive first step. And we go back to the idea of autonomy of race, to your point, and it's such a big question. But in one way, I see it, I was telling you in the question, I see it being, in the French case, tied up, class and race being closely intertwined in a French context, when you look at what's been done on the banlieue and everything else, and being difficult to separate the two and to grant race such a, or too much of a greater or great autonomy. In the meantime, we have many examples and we have films on this subject that show how it transcends the economic frontiers, how wealthier, racialized person encounter the exact same problems than the lower class racialized person. And there is here a convergence of interest and stigmatization that pushes us to think about race in a way, possibly as separate from class or some issues, right? Now, Barthes was, of course, here strongly inspired by Marx in his book. He's coming from a Marxist standpoint. He's trying to decipher science and having to do with bourgeois ideology, and he adopted the other way around, where it's about class, and he implemented a few examples where race plays a part within this bourgeois discourse. We did the contrary, right? We wanted bigger place to race than to the class issue, class being always tied up, but at some points, and that was probably unconscious, race probably ran along with it, and we dropped some of the intersection with class in order to focus on what it means to be black in contemporary France, independently from your class apartness. So in that case, I guess I'm going towards zero understanding of it to some degree. Although most people will push for a constant intersectional approach to those two things. And in that sense, we are not exactly in line with what has been done in the past few years. There was also a problem with the book, and we focused on Black France. Many people ask us why not also on issues pertaining to the North African diaspora and so on. We also see some type of autonomy to the question of the Black France question as it relates to diversity. It's not exactly the same, of course, as the issue of Maghreb population. So all of them can be approached, I would say, in an autonomous way, although the intersection would be the most productive way to deal with all of that. I don't see how anyone could claim to be able to discuss those things in a less than 1,000-page book, highly complex approach. We did take the religion aspect out of the equation, for instance, here. And that's a shortcoming in a way, but we are clear about it in the introduction. We just focus on one thing, and Islam was not a women focus, even though it shows up from time to time, but same thing for class, right? So in that sense, we granted some degree of autonomy to the question of race in that question, and we'll see what the returns are. So far, no one has pointed out, but it is something that could have been addressed probably in a better way. Yeah. But I'd like to hear what your thoughts about this also as we're wrapping up, if you have time after as well.
We should.
One last sentence, because I just think the way we were, or at least speaking for myself, the way I used class was not to use it as some sort of super category that determines all other forms of discrimination and inequality, but rather to pointing at a certain strategy in among the left, especially in the US, to use category like race to obfuscate other economic inequalities and other like equally material forms of inequality, because after all, it's all, of course, it's not simply like the imaginary is connected to very very visible material effects. So, so this just to maybe clarify.
Well, we should wrap up. Please join me in thanking Étienne.